Okay, we're going to look back at an ancient folklore and mythology that probably a lot of you are extremely familiar with, and some that you aren't, that is actually still attached to it. Leading from Mother Goose tales, Brothers Grimm. I do a lot of videos about things like that because there's some truth and mythology in it too, and not just an Aesop's fable, which ends up being a portion of the tale that we remember. Looking here, you can see a stork standing in a clear running river. And that symbology may not mean anything to many people. Seeing the fact that the first rays of the sun are the sunset is putting its beams upon him, showing him up, might indicate his importance. Perhaps the witch-looking crone, if you will, on the woven bridge that's made naturally, like an elf would have done, might show some symbology connected to it with this also. And the symbology and the thoughts that go along with that. If you look closely to the left of her, through the trees and up above her in the sun there, you see lots of butterflies. And that indeed is attached to it. For this in a way was maybe some way of the birds and the bees of an ancient time. And it probably goes back more than 50,000 years. Let's look into this. So join me in this little cottage over here with this lady in waiting, which may not be a crone or a witch. And let's talk about this. Just came out this year, right before Thanksgiving, so I thought I'd put this out directly after necessarily, maybe something leading into the time of the new year, for we celebrate sacred births at that time and so on, and so maybe this would be a little more fitting. The bringer of souls, the stork myth, and ancient pan-European beliefs, pan meaning across. Ancient beliefs are often a complex puzzle, and putting the pieces together can often be extremely challenging. Time has its way with unwritten traditions, and little of what is written down survives to this day. But to the keen eyes of historians, archaeologists, and above all ethnologists, little everyday details can mean a lot. That means that with hard work and dedication, we can observe very old beliefs and traditions in use to this very day. Did you know that a bird, one commonly taken for granted, offers amazing insight into the beliefs of Europe's oldest inhabitants? That's right, the common stork played a central role in the most intimate traditions of ancient cultures, both Proto-European and Indo-European. They give a declamation here. Let's learn about the stork and how it shaped the beliefs of our forebears. The reason she gives a declamation there is she's talking about the ancient people that were in Europe before all of the Proto-Indo-Europeans came in, and this melding, which over time has been a conflagration. We talked about Mother Goose. So there is goose and swans that go along with this, but storks is held constant through this also. There's a few others, birds, but as you go back, it changes. Whenever it changes, it shows you something about it. And then of the oldest people that we have contact with and drawings of and so on, leads to another bird that has a similar aspect to it. We'll get into that. A remnant of something greater, storks in ancient beliefs. The ritualistic image of the stork is present in most European nations. This is a direct link that shows us that the stork was once a widespread, perhaps even unified beliefs all of across of Europe. And they're talking about way back then, like Proto-Europeans, Aryan, in a step back, reaching past and into the last ice age. During the period of which Proto-European cultures emerged and developed, before many migration periods that we talked about before, Europeans lived in mostly matriarchal societies and maintained nature-connected beliefs, which in part survived the inevitable influences of time and history. One remnant we can easily see is the elves, and I've talked recently about this repeatedly on how that connects to ancient people and waves of Proto-Europeans that came across, and the Picts, where are the Pixies, and so on, Tuatha etc. With the migration of Indo-European tribes into European sphere, beliefs became a mixture of the old and the new and took on new characteristics. In particular, they shifted a largely peaceful and matriarchal viewpoint to a paradigm of war. Nevertheless, the old beliefs did not die out, and the tradition of the stork in Europe is certainly an excellent example of how old beliefs continue to thrive alongside the new thinking. Well, in a time where things grew so much, as I described before, that the snake grew so big and had been apart so long, it ended up like two snakes coming together, biting itself on its own tail. That symbology is even shown. There started to become a time of war. We always equate that with Aries, in the time of Aries and Mars. Well, let's just continue. Modern European nations are often a partial hybrid of patriarchal haplogroups. We've talked about haplogroups quite a bit recently, meaning that their DNA is often a combination of both the Proto- and Indo-European cultures. Certain areas, regions, and nations of Europe display more traces than others based on ancient migration and the development of new influential cultures. One that we did a video on recently was that they have a confirmed thing on King Tut's DNA now, where it was supposedly people were hemming and hawing around. It's R1b, same as Tsar Nicholas of Russia, and 70 people of Europe that's far Western Europe, and over 50% of all Western Europeans. And it's not necessarily from his, because the new paper talks about, and these were the people that had done all the DNA tests to verify a lineage and who was the younger lady and so on related to King Tut, and they figured out that's his mom and that's Nefertiti, and they made that recreation of her that some people threw a fit about, but at the same time it shows that that whole lineage there would have had that same DNA. And when we talk about it passing on, people were like, well, King Tut didn't have any kids, and it's like, no, it goes from way before, and they had a granddad, and in fact, as far as we can go in it, those people were offspring of other people that were nobility in Egypt going way back. And you can look at the very first examples that say blue-eyed Egyptians. Just type that into Google image, and you'll see these crystal blue eyes, and it's the very earliest dynasties. So while we can't find some of them, and through that time right there, the statues show a verified continuity. We haven't been able to get some DNA out of the older ones, but with the new techniques, we've gotten quite a bit. In fact, they did a test of hundreds of mummies, being able to get like 93 viable ones out of an ancient graveyard that comes before the end of the Middle Kingdom and goes all the way through. And because during that period they would have seen the changes that would have happened, Egypt was static before, of course, and instead of seeing them flip and flop around with some Persian DNA, and then all of a sudden here comes the Greeks and there goes the Romans, they saw none. Another pinpoint, they say all the DNA that shows up, Saharan DNA, shows up much later, but that's in the current population, which has a 1% connection with the ancient people they found in the graveyard, and that's the common people. Again, so that haplogroup shows up in Europe, though, so that's one way to show it and everything. Such other groups as U6 has been found there, K, other ones like that. And that's as far as Egypt. But in a moment, we're going to come back into that one more time here. So, certain areas and regions in Northern Europe display different floats of it, but whenever you look at a haplogroup chart, you can kind of see and detect, and when they find something and you look at, well, where is that at? Haplogroup, duh. And it'll show you where most of the people in a modern day that have that same genetics are. Not necessarily an elder point. You'd have to get that through archaeological sites. See this stork carrying this baby, and it looks like he's just dropped it out of his teeth or his beak. Well, there's some elder kids there, and they're catching it. They've all got their aprons out, and they're going to catch the baby when he comes. And that's a stork in an old German painting delivering a new baby. And Germanic culture has a lot to do with this because they, of course, have a big connection with Proto-Europeans, as we talked about in a lot of other videos. And the other people, too. Don't leave out the Danes or anybody else. Scotch, Irish, Welsh, the whole gambit. However, it is not the DNA structure that is crucial in the preservation of ancient beliefs, It's the culture itself. With the onset of modern life and the inevitable passing of time, modern, highly developed, and mainly Western European nations have largely distanced themselves from yearly traditions performed at home. As the classic central image of the hearth and the homestead disappears, so too are the traditional activities passed on through generations. Seasonal things, stuff that happens in families and stuff that your grandma did with your mom and you saw, but you're not passing it on. Kids nowadays are blah blah blah. Yeah. That tried to happen before a few times, I'm sure. It carried until us, though, didn't it? However, in those nations in which the traditional lifestyle does survive, in the villages, remote areas, rural regions, and so on, one can very easily spot traditions that are thousands of years old. Well, let's look into this and what's it got to do with one type of bird. That's stork. Modern Slavic nations provide the best examples of this, with a huge rural population and a strong adherence to traditional family life. Old beliefs in Slavic cultures lived longer and often survived. Considering this, it is only logical to use Slavic beliefs as a perfect lens for understanding the myth of the stork, for it is in these areas that it survives in its clearest forms today. In past times, Slavs believed in a unique form of afterlife. It varied ever so slightly from tribe to tribe, but the core of the afterlife belief is the same. The soul of the deceased would pass into a bird, commonly a stork or a nightjar. In some places, though, a moth or a bee. So I said birds and bees. And travel for 40 days. That's a cute little number, isn't it? Towards the underworld. Now, what we're talking about here is that by the earliest forms we can see them, there's a little variation on a theme, but that's that same song. And at one time, great grandma must have had the same song as them, and it's just that's the variation that's happening in it. Kind of like the telephone game. But you can see that it was held all the way to that point, too. It shows you things were kept long, long, long into the future, into the close past, actually. In fact, a lot of it's still around us. Again, Mother Goose. You are familiar, right? Storks bring babies. Sometimes it's Cabbage Patch. Sometimes the stork drops it in the Cabbage Patch. But that's a modern thing, and Cabbage Patch dolls, da-da-da. And you'll know it from that. And will that get passed on? Remember the storks? One of the only representations I really know of in modern time real well about that is in Dumbo, and they had the storks. Remember that? Remember how that works? Also, there was a problem that started out the Grinch, but that really started out and then it ended up being umbrellas and stuff like that, didn't it? And they floated down. Anyhow, so it involves a moth or a bee perhaps, but everything else seems about the same. But then you realize through studying it that it really is based on this stork thing that had come before. Now, if we study before that and differences on people that before that knew of each other and had this common into them, and those other people, it also becomes goose or a swan. Now, the goose has still got the matriarchal situation hooked up to it. For the other one is called a gander, and we'll go into that in a minute too. But before that point, believe it or not, it goes to buzzards, vultures. You can see vulture symbology and death symbology and things going hand in hand, and we'll get into that in a minute. But remember closely, Egypt's got it on their headgear and stuff. It goes along with it too. However, the Slavic underworld was not as grim or deathly as elsewhere or some other people. For them, it was a world of green pastures, like Elysian fields, and eternal summer, with an enormous linden tree guarded by the god Veles. See if that doesn't sound a little familiar with the Yggdrasil beliefs, or the beliefs of Elysian fields, or so on, or even the Egyptian belief where they're going to go into this other place and everything else. There's not a tree so prominent in Egypt. Well, if you look at it, their trees are just pretty much gone. So these tree worshiping people that had all that too, but Egypt has an incredible tree worship people aren't even aware of, where they use sycamore and yew trees and stuff, and a lot of cedars, but they had to get them from special people they were friends with. Right up here. Their tar sap that they cover their body with, their embalming coating, is made out of pine tar. They figured out it's from up in Europe, and they're trying to figure out exactly which location that would have been at the time. So here we have a world tree sitting around in the place in the afterlife, and the branches of this tree, the birds of souls, would roost waiting for a time when they can reincarnate. I'm sorry, but instantly I flashed to the Sumerian tale of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and whenever he dies and he sees what's going to come, the people are made into birds and stuff. And whenever he wakes him, there are birds that are starting to peck at him, and he knows he's about to go, and he tells him what happens of the afterlife situation, and the birds fly up. And is this symbolically of what they're about to talk about also? The name of this underworld, though, that they had was Varaj, or Iraj, and it survives in many Slavic languages today. Iraj. Almost sounds like Iraq. As in a word to denote paradise. The roosting birds were returned to the world when a new child was born, bringing with them a new soul to give to the newborn. Thus, the circle of reincarnation continues. This is like the Hall of Souls or the Guff that you hear about in the Bible and some stories and things. And there was that Demi Moore movie with that guy that was supposed to play a recoming of Christ, that and they go through it in the Seven Seals and things. Oh, back in the 80s. You remember what I'm talking about? So looky here. This looks familiar maybe in a child's room. There's a stork, there's a baby. It's a common effigy. We understand it today as well as a heart symbology or something like that. But what does it have to do with? Well, it goes back quite some distance. How the stork became a guide between the worlds. This reincarnated belief leads to a number of very interesting points. First, the strong adherence of all Proto and Indo-Europeans with ancestor cult worship that was similar and goes back another step. But as a result, the souls of the forebears would never truly be gone. The second point of interest is that the mostly Proto-Indo-European belief in reincarnation. And the third point of interest is that there are very simple observances by our ancestors regarding the natural worlds around them and the way everything worked. I could go off, but let's just continue. By observing the storks, which travel south to warmer climates every year and then returning by the spring, the ancient Slavs had the perfect example of their reincarnation belief. you see this migrational period. In fact, a people that would have lived kind of nomadic and traveled back and forth and south and north a little bit with their herds and flocks and things like this would be very geared up on this situation. And of course, when the birds fly south, you do, there's almost a sign and a symbology of it. Like when you start to see baby birds around all the place or things show up. Whenever you see lines of arrow-headed flocks of geese and ducks and they're all flying south for the winter, you know, here it comes. For the ancient Slav, winter was the dark half of the year, or dark part of the year, ironically, just like the Celts looked at it and so on, symbolizing death. Thus, they assumed that storks carrying the souls of the dead traveled south to their paradise, previously mentioned, and with the arrival of spring, the storks would return and complete the cycle of reincarnation. To this day, it is the most common anecdotal in Slavic nations and elsewhere in Europe that storks bring babies to the world. What almost no one knows is that the deep and meaningful origins of that simple belief. Well, I'll take a step of it, or a layer of an onion off of it right now, even though I've already given away a vulture thing in ancient times where we're going with this. But we're talking about cycles, reincarnation, and ancient beliefs, but you still have that today. Jesus had done this thing, all this type of stuff, right? And the death of winter, when the sun dies and then it's reborn again every year. Spring is the point that it overtakes it. And along with all these ancient tales, there was Inanna and Dumuzi, a Jesus-like tale. And people even took and decorated trees and the whole 9 yards for it. It's thousands of years old. But he'd be reborn again on December 25th, but as an equinoxial event. But at the same time, this was a reincarnation event, just like what it had been going. And so whenever we have something like that today that actually is a birth event, it's the opposite, but you can see it's the same thing and it goes with it in seasons, right? And so this paradise is always somewhere else and come back, or a distant land or something else that these birds come from, but that must be this paradise that they go to and come back from. Sub-Saharan Africa wasn't known of. People in Egypt even would see them flying over and going, and now they're going to South America, or they're going to Australia, or they're going to other places. But then ancient mariners would see things like that and go, well, you know, those things are landing somewhere. Birds were used a lot in aviation or navigation and everything too. It's the reason in Noah's thing he lets loose a couple and then all of a sudden a dove and it comes back. There's a raven in that story too, which a raven takes a part of this too. A raven's a real smart animal, but also he's an animal of death but of knowledge. He's real smart. So Odin had two of them and they searched the world, would tell him about things. Just like ancient merchants might come and whisper in his ear. So they assumed that the storks carrying the souls of the dead traveled south to the paradise previously mentioned, and then the arrival in spring would be them coming back. But we can see that. Butterflies have the same effect and stuff, and you talked about a monarch butterfly and its mass migrations and stuff before. In Slavic languages, the words that denote a stork are a key evidence to this once widespread belief. In Ukrainian, for example, there are numerous names for a stork and many beliefs too, but one name was for a while most common, God's bird. And in Serbia, however, a stork is known as roda. The core of this word is rod, which means kin, family, lineage, tribe, genus, yield, harvest, and goes with all those words. It also denotes birth, by the way. This is a huge insight into how important this bird once was. Thus, in Serbian, its name can literally be translated as kindred, birther, and so on. And of course, in all these nations, it is considered a great misfortune to harm, chase away, or to kill a stork. To do so would bring on a great and heavy curse. That's why today in many villages of northern Serbia, Hungary, and Ukraine, Slovakia, Poland, one can see numerous storks roosting on chimneys, on telephone poles, and church steeples. No one disturbs them, and everyone looks on them kindly. In fact, they won't talk about it here, but I've heard that they put the things on the chimneys that they could possibly roost on and things as an extra and don't mess with it at a point because they hope there's fertility in the house and the stork comes. A whole lot different than we look at pigeons, but they have a common notation, by the way. Maybe a little more of a nuisance. So we've talked about that, and then that strange tree. Well, there's a lot of different trees that have been taken by certain people, and because you see a certain tree, people have said maybe that has a connotation to even how far reaching it could possibly go. This is a depiction of that linden type tree and a world type tree. Whenever you see the one at Disney that's so thick trunked and big and round, you can see somebody could have carved around on this thing just like that and made the shapes, had stories going around on it and so on. It's a world tree type. What is it? Well, it's a linden tree. I know a preacher lived up the street, had a kid I hung around with a little bit. His last name was Linden also, and it's funny how that went together. You looked up their name and what it said and it meant and everything. It's like, what? The linden tree is strongly connected with the souls of the god Veles in ancient Germanic myths. So the birds roosting in Veles linden tree is clear evidence of the shared Proto-Balto-Slavic roots. We can use the great importance of the stork in all modern Baltic countries today. So this is a mid-time period and after the first surge for sure. Since 1974, the white stork has been the national bird of Lithuania. And the bird is an inseparable part of their traditions. My Valenius is big. At one end a stork stands, at the other end it claps its beak, is the beginning of an iconic Lithuanian poem related to its capital city. And like elsewhere in Europe, the Lithuanians still jokingly claim that their babies are delivered by storks. The stork brought a brother is the popular saying of all Lithuanian midwives. It's now, what is spoken though is Gandras Atanis Broluka. And what's weird about that is if you look, that's Gandras, and what is that? That's where we get gander from. And so it also contains that goose, that mother goose. Anyhow, prosperity, harmony, and love are guaranteed to every family on whose house a stork nests. Aha! And there is a major Veles, a major Slavic god of earth, water, and the underworld, who is strongly connected with the linden, American basswood, what you may make a base out of, by the way. Linden tree. So this god of the underworld isn't so bad. Everybody nowadays has got this thing, well, he's got to be the devil and everything. No, man, if you did good, you're supposed to go to a good place. That's the way it works out. Yeah. Or if you do bad, maybe you just become nothing. But one of the unique important insights in this ancient belief is also preserved in Germany. Just like the Slavic myths, this German belief points to a much older tradition. According to this German myth, if one lays down on the ground beside a spring that flows from beneath a tree, one can hear the merry voices of unborn children living in the underworld. The babbling of a brook, and you can hear children. There are 4 or 5 places I found that in my mythological books or folklore books here. Not all of it are actually directly hooked up to Germanic or Austrian type people, but then when you look at who that is and where it came from, where they spread out to eventually, and who ended up being who, and yeah, okay, from before, okay. Anyhow, you can hear these children's voices, but this Germanic belief takes on a unique turn. These unborn souls were then fished out by storks, like a pelican or something, and they grab the river from the rivers and streams, lakes and bogs, and then brought to newborn children. This is one of the aspects of the tradition that makes the stork a sort of guide between the world of the dead and the world of the living. It's also whenever I told you how they consider the southern hemisphere of the world to be the underworld. It's because the sun goes there then. It's over you in summer, it's over them. It's the flip side of it. They knew it was a sphere. It's the way it works. It's under, down under. So it's the way they interpreted it, and it's the land of the dead. How does this go on? Well, with migrating birds and stuff. It also has a connection to vultures I'll get to in a minute. Where am I at here? 30? Great. So now we're looking at a Book of the Dead, where the person is relegated to being a shadow now. And you can see this human-headed stork type creature that's on there. Also, in front of the person, there's an icon that shows you a bird. In fact, all along the wall and perimeters of this, you can see different birds that are in here. Now, sometimes they're an eagle, sometimes they're a stork. And there's two different types too, and so they've realized that one of these is like the stork situation, the other one is more of an ibis type situation, like associated with Thoth, and it's just the way the little beak and the way their neck looks whenever they're sitting. There's a couple of other birds too, of course, with falcons and so on. Here's one right here. And so you can see that one's different than the other ones. Well, it's supposed to be an aspect, that griffin-headed person, that angel, if you will, is associated with a ba, which is an aspect of the human soul connected with storks in the afterlife, flying from a tomb to the travel in the land of the dead. But, well, I'll let him say it, and then I'll get into it. Now, what we told you is that this connection between storks and soul is also found in ancient Egypt. In Egyptian hieroglyphs and iconography, the word ba is depicted as a black stork. Ba is one of the aspects of the human soul, more precisely a human personality, or everything making them unique as an individual. And so the body shown as a shadow or a black in there all of a sudden is a pickage, and the Ka and Ba statues that they have are just like, well, that's like me and my shadow, or the shadow that he has to get back of Peter Pan. Pan again means cross. Peter means father. Pitar. Let that sink in for just a second. Ba is one of the aspects of the human soul, more precisely a person's personality or everything making them unique as individuals. Ancient Egyptians believed that Ba is the aspect of the soul that lives on after death. In this special land that if kid dies, they go to, and they never get old, and they never die, and lost boys, and back to it. Ba was almost always depicted as a bird, often with a human head, which flies out of a tomb to travel to the afterlife. And since storks that migrated south from Europe spend the winter in Egypt, one can again draw a parallel that when they went back to Europe, the Egyptians would have considered that as the journey to the afterlife. So imagine that when the birds fly south for the winter into Egypt and the underworld and the land of the dead, as it was called in a lot of places, that would be one people's doing it, and as it yin and yanged and flipped the other way, the Egyptians looked at it in quite the same way. Now let me go one more layer of an onion. They have, I'll go 2 layers. They have a Bennu bird. Yeah, it's like an egret or a heron, so it's the same thing. And that is their representation of Phoenix. And then, in effect, it's the sign of rebirth, just like the Phoenix story, which apparently comes from long, long ago because they've got it in their starting. Not something they picked up later, but it comes from the way before they came down into Egypt. Well before you're willing to give it in time. But way before even all that we're talking about now, there was a vulture hooked up with the same symbology. You can see the remnants of it dying out at Göbekli Tepe, and they show it in the vulture symbol and that stele, which everybody is equated going with death and the younger Dryas and this, that, and the other. What are these vultures about? And they make clear importance about it. And he's holding this thing. They say, well, there's the comet coming. There it is. It's the way the sky would have looked at that time. And it's incredible. It's a Stonehenge looking type place. It's got, they say, up to 50 circles into it. It's huge, gargantuan, and of course 10,000 BC or more as they dig into it. But it goes back earlier than that. We have cave paintings where people are put up on a dais, almost like you would see in Conan the Barbarian, or you see in whenever they burn um, Anakin in, or Darth Vader in Star Wars, and put him on this little dais and then they burn him. Well, that's a cremation type, and that was going on too. But before even that, it seems like, and they've seen a lot of pictures of it, with swastikas in there and all kinds of stuff, but it's got vultures circling around. Now, one can easily make the connection of death and vultures because anytime you see them swirling around over a place like a tornado, there's something dead down there. They can detect it almost magically. People couldn't understand how they knew, but they just showed up. Like that raven who just kind of shows up and says, "What you doing?" Think about that for a second. So that also leads all the way through this animism that people have of wings on them, and you think that angels or something is something different, da da da, but it's definitely from that, and we still hold on to this day where people are going to get their wings and all of that. You know, we're coming up on Christmas, and every time a bell rings, but you look at all these pagan cultures that didn't have anything to do with that, and they've got all these people with wings and gods with wings and stuff and everything, and it's all attached to that because they live up in heaven. And these birds come down and take pieces of you and take you up to heaven. It's the way it used to work. So, so we'll look at one Wayback Machine picture right here, where they're showing this ichthyophallic statue or painting done in Lagoon Cave, which is Cro-Magnon man again now. It's a bird-headed man, though. He's got a little bird head on him. He's got a boner. There's the bird with the stilt legs that are right over here, and it looks like a bull has killed him. A lot of people have made the connection. Well, first of all, also there's an extra line drawn in here and cut up that shows the geometry angle of it. But is this that he died during the time of Taurus? Is this, that, and the other? Or did he get killed by a bull somehow and he turned into that bird? So, could stork beliefs come from the Stone Age? Well, some researchers feel that the connection between birds and storks and souls in the afterlife is even older. This leads us to the enigmatic Lagoon caves in France, which have been dated to roughly the early Magdalenian period, more than 17,000 years ago. Cro-Magnon man, but Cro-Magnon is no longer used. It's if you watch my videos, I talk about it a bunch. Basically, it's called early European modern humans now because why? Because they're still, haplogroups are still here. They've done DNA tests and got it out of it now. It goes back 50,000 years. That's why I said that in the first part of it. While all these drawings are utterly fascinating, one stands out. One of the deepest, most unreachable levels of the cave, one can only be accessed by ropes or ladders. There's a one-of-a-kind painting. It depicts a bird-headed ichthyophallic man with a erect swing, seemingly being killed by an enraged buffalo. Is that showing afterlife situation too, with this rebirth with swing? Could this be the earliest depiction of an ancient myth of souls migrating with birds? Could it be that the ancient artist deliberately painted it in the most unreachable part, which could symbolize the underworld? And lastly, can the picture be the simplest evidence that we need that the hunter killed by the buffalo becomes a bird in death? Well, we may never know the answers to these questions exactly, but the little details are there to tickle our brains about it, aren't they? Well, there are other cave drawings going up from this time and even closer to our modern time where they have this deist situation going on that she doesn't mention. But I'm going to mention another thing, I guess, right now as we go into it. Let me go over here. And what you see here is them getting stuck. Don't tell me it's going to do this to me. Really? See if I can get the article back up real quick. Is this it? Is this it? Nat Geo, yeah. So, getting a little validation of here, this golden elder and how it works back in times, as I said. If I can get this to come up. Now it's not responding. Recover the page then. I beg your pardon. Smoke 'em if you got 'em. Whoop, here we go. So what we're looking at here is a blurry as hell picture out of a potato cam. Just kidding. It should clear up. What you're looking at is a vulture bone flute. It's done apparently out of a wing arm bone. There we go. And if you'll look, each one of these sections is hollowed out so you put your fingers on it. And it's actually tuned to the modern scale that we use. Yep. And it's been dated to 40,000 years old, and they find along with it mammoth flutes and pipes too, right? And this is at Holfels. I did a video on it here about, oh man, it's been almost a year ago now, so there we go. There's the connection of how old that flute bone and everything, and was that played for somebody during the dead or something to go along with that? Well, apparently it's got a lot to do with it. Wow. I need to reload my system here because I've got too many things pulled open, and after a little while it just goes, In fact, it couldn't go back to where we were. But we can make it. Yep. So, we've done quite a bit here. We're at 43. Well, I hope I end up finishing it off. So we have this ideal that's here. Well, another crucial insight to the extreme age of the stork belief brings us once more to Germanic belief. Germans' early history, both storks and swallows were the heralds of the goddess Hulda, or the Frau Halle, like holy, and were considered as heralds of spring. Hulda is widely considered as a mother goddess that predates the emergence of the Germanic people. It was once a major deity of Neolithic Europe, and also a neighboring ancient Prussians considered storks as envoys from one of their major deities, Protrimpus. And if we look here, you can see her in the clouds. Looks like she's shaking snow out to everybody, perhaps going along with that. And in fact, the stamp is St. Nicholas here, going off of that. But yeah, okay, so there's Frau Halle. And nevertheless, some scholars argue that the myths pertaining to the stork are purely Indo-European, even though we, as stated, so much evidence points to much older origin. But it could have been one of the few shared beliefs between the Proto-Europeans and the migrating newcomers. Well, yeah, it looks like it, and certain people used swans and things like that later. Other people were using storks and so on, even all through the Egyptians. So that had come from way back when. Yeah. Even though the main aspect of this belief is clearly a reincarnation of the migration of souls, some scholars ascribe it to the agricultural aspect. While it is agreed by all the reverence of the white stork its origins in the Stone Age, it could be said that it received a new and expanded character with the arrival of Indo-Europeans and all the new technologies they